Do you like the hair? That's because it's Siouxsie Wiles' birthday today. She's a wonderful New Zealand-based scientist. I think she's a microbiologist and a whole lot of other stuff. And she's really good at explaining science about complicated things in ways that normal people can understand. And she's helped a lot of New Zealanders to understand important things to do with COVID-19 and how we keep ourselves safe and a whole lot of things like that. So we just wanted to wish, as New Zealanders, we wanted to wish her a happy birthday today. And she's got bright pink hair. So now some of us are sporting bright pink hair for the day. So anyway, on with today's reading. And no, I'm not going to wear this wig properly and have all the bits tucked in. It doesn't look right on me. So today's reading is once again more of Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. And we are starting at chapter 3 because we finished chapter 2 last time, which was Friday in New Zealand time. It's Monday here now. So chapter 3 is Looking Glass Insects. So prepare for some weird things. Oh, getting comfortable with fluffy things tickling. So anyway, Looking Glass Insects. Of course, the first thing to do was to make a grand survey of the country she was going to travel through. It's something very like learning geography, thought Alice, as she stood on tiptoe, in hopes of being able to see a little further. Principal rivers, there are none. Principal mountains. I'm on the only one, but I don't think it's got any name. Principal towns. Why, what are those creatures making honey down there? They can't be bees. Nobody ever saw bees a mile off, you know. And for some time she stood silent, watching one of them that was bustling about among the flowers, poking its proboscis into them. Just as if it was a regular bee, thought Alice. However, this was anything but a regular bee. In fact, it was an elephant, as Alice soon found out, though the idea quite took her breath away at first. And what enormous flowers they must be was her next idea. Something like cottages with the roofs taken off and stalks put to them. And what quantities of honey they must make. I think I'll go down and... No, I won't just yet, she went on, checking herself just as she was beginning to run down the hill and trying to find some excuse for turning shy so suddenly. It'll never do to go down among them without a good long branch to brush them away. And what fun it'll be when they ask me how I like my walk. I shall say, oh, I like it well enough. Here came the favourite little toss of the head. Only it was so dusty and hot, and the elephants did tease so. I think I'll go down the other way, she said after a pause, and perhaps I may visit the elephants later on. Besides, I do so want to get into the third square. So with this excuse she ran down the hill and jumped over the first of the 6 little brooks. And here there's a pause in the story. And we continue. Tickets, please, said the guard, putting his head in at the window. In a moment everybody was holding out a ticket. They were about the same size as the people. The tickets, and quite seemed to fill the carriage. Now then, show your ticket, child, the guard went on, looking angrily at Alice. And a great many voices all said together, like the chorus of a song, thought Alice, don't keep him waiting, child. Why, his time is worth £1,000 a minute. I'm afraid I haven't got one, Alice said in a frightened tone. There wasn't a ticket office where I came from. And again the chorus of voices went on. There wasn't room for one where she came from. The land there is worth £1,000 an inch. Don't make excuses, said the guard. You should have bought one from the engine driver. And once more the chorus of voices went on. With the man that drives the engine, why, the smoke alone is worth £1,000 a puff. Alice thought to herself, then there's no use in speaking. The voices didn't join in at this time, as she hadn't spoken out loud, but to her great surprise they all thought in chorus. I hope you understand what thinking in chorus means, for I must confess that I don't. Better say nothing at all. Language is worth £1,000 a word. I shall dream about £1,000 tonight. I know I shall, thought Alice. All this time the guard was looking at her, first through a telescope, then through a microscope, and then through an opera glass, that's like miniature binoculars, that you used to take to the opera house so you could sit there and see the people on the stage that was such a long way away. At last he said, "You're travelling the wrong way," and shut up the window and went away. "So young a child," said the gentleman sitting opposite to her. He was dressed in white paper. "Ought to know which way she's going, even if she doesn't know her own name." A goat that was sitting next to the gentleman in white shut his eyes and said in a loud voice, "She ought to know her way to the ticket office, even if she doesn't know her alphabet." There was a beetle sitting next to the goat. It was a very queer carriage full of passengers altogether, and as the rule seemed to be that they should all speak in turn, he went on with, "She'll have to go back from here as luggage." Alice couldn't see who was sitting beyond the beetle, but a hoarse voice spoke next. "Change engines," it said, and was obliged to leave off. "It sounds like a horse," Alice thought to herself, and an extremely small voice close to her ear said, "You might make a joke on that, something about horse and horse, sore throat, you know." Then a very gentle voice in a distance said, "She must be labelled lass with care, you know." And after that other voices went on. What a number of people there were in the carriage, thought Alice, saying, "She must go by post, as she's got a head on her. She must be sent as a message by the telegraph. She must draw the train herself the rest of the way," and so on. But the gentleman dressed in white paper leaned forwards and whispered in her ear, "Never mind what they all say, my dear, but take a return ticket every time the train stops." "Indeed I shan't," Alice said rather impatiently. "I don't belong to this railway journey at all. I was in a wood just now, and wish I could get back there." "You might make a joke on that," said the little voice close to her ear. "Something about you would if you could, you know." "Don't tease so," said Alice, looking about in vain to see where the voice came from. "If you're so anxious to have a joke made, why don't you make one yourself?" The little voice sighed deeply. It was very unhappy, evidently, and Alice would have said something pitying to comfort it, if it would only sigh like other people, she thought. But this was such a wonderfully small sigh that she wouldn't have heard it at all if it hadn't come quite close to her ear. The consequence of this was that it tickled her ear very much, and quite took off her thoughts from the unhappiness of the poor little creature. "I know you are a friend," the little voice went on, "a dear friend and an old friend, and you won't hurt me, though I am an insect." "What kind of insect?" Alice inquired a little anxiously. What she really wanted to know was whether it could sting or not, but she thought this wouldn't be quite a civil question to ask. "What? Then you don't?" the little voice began, when it was drowned by a shrill scream from the engine, and everybody jumped up in alarm, Alice among the rest. The horse, who had put his head out of the window, quietly drew it in and said, "It's only a brook we have to jump over." Everyone seemed satisfied with this, though Alice felt a little nervous at the idea of trains jumping at all. "However, it will take us into the fourth square. That's some comfort," she said to herself. In another moment she felt the carriage rise straight up into the air, and in her fright she caught at the thing nearest to her hand, which happened to be the goat's beard. But the beard seemed to melt away as she touched it, and she found herself sitting quietly under a tree, while the gnat, for that was the insect she had been talking to, was balancing itself on a twig just over her head and fanning her with its wings. It certainly was a very large gnat, about the size of a chicken, Alice thought. Still, she couldn't feel nervous with it after all. They had been talking together for so long. "Then you don't like all insects?" the gnat went on as quietly as if nothing had happened. Let's just see what it was that the gnat had started to say. It had started with, "What, then you don't?" and then the train did the jump. "Don't like all insects," was the conclusion. "I like them when they can talk," Alice said. "None of them ever talk where I come from." "What sort of insects do you rejoice in where you come from?" the gnat inquired. "I don't rejoice in insects at all," Alice explained, "because I'm rather afraid of them, at least the large kinds. But I can tell you the names of some of them." "Of course, they answer to their names," said the gnat carelessly. "I never knew them to do it." "What's the use in having names," the gnat said, "if they won't answer to them?" I'm just going to plug my phone in before it goes flat. Excuse me. There. And unlocked. Yay. Now I can see what you're saying in the chat, if you are. No use to them. Oh, they won't answer them, I think. "What's the use of their having names," said the gnat, "if they won't answer to them?" "No use to them," said Alice, "but it's useful to the people who name them, I suppose. If not, why do things have names at all?" "I can't say," the gnat replied. "Further on, in the wood down there, they've got no names. However, go on with your list of insects. You're wasting time." "Well, there's the horsefly," Alice began, counting off names on her fingers. "All right," said the gnat. "Halfway up that bush you'll see a rocking horsefly, if you look. It's made entirely of wood and gets about by swinging itself from branch to branch." "What does it live on?" Alice asked with great curiosity. "Sap and sawdust," said the gnat. "Go on with the list." Alice looked up at the rocking horsefly with great interest and made up her mind that it must have been just repainted, it looked so bright and sticky. And then she went on, "And there's the dragonfly." "Look on the branch above your head," said the gnat, "and there you'll find a snapdragonfly. Its body is made of plum pudding, its wings of holly leaves, and its head is a raisin burning in brandy." "And what does it live on?" "Frumenty and mince pie," the gnat replied, "and it makes its nest in a Christmas box." "And then there's the butterfly," Alice went on, after she had taken a good look at the insect with its head on fire, and had thought to herself, "I wonder if that's the reason insects are so fond of flying into candles, because they want to turn into snapdragonflies." "Crawling at your feet," said the gnat. Alice drew her feet back in some alarm. "You may observe a bread and butter fly. Its wings are thin slices of bread and butter, its body is a crust, and its head is a lump of sugar." "And what does it live on?" "Weak tea with cream in it." A new difficulty came into Alice's head. Supposing it couldn't find any, she suggested. "Then it would die, of course." "But that must happen very often," Alice remarked thoughtfully. "It always happens," said the gnat. After this, Alice was silent for a minute or two, pondering. The gnat amused itself meanwhile by humming round and round her head. At last it settled again and remarked, "I suppose you don't want to lose your name?" "No, indeed," said Alice a little anxiously. "And yet, I don't know," the gnat went on in a careless tone. "Only think how convenient it would be if you could manage to go home without it. For instance, if the governess wanted to call you to your lessons, she would call out, 'Come here,' and then there she would have to leave off, because there wouldn't be any name for her to call. And of course, you wouldn't have to go, you know." "That would never do, I'm sure," said Alice. "The governess would never think of excusing me lessons for that. If she couldn't remember my name, she'd call me Miss, as the servants do." "Well, if she said Miss and didn't say anything more," the gnat remarked, "of course you'd miss your lessons." "That's a joke. I wish you had made it." "Why do you wish I had made it?" Alice asked. "It's a very bad one." But the gnat only sighed deeply. While two large tears came rolling down its cheeks. "You shouldn't make jokes," Alice said, "if it makes you so unhappy." Then came another of those melancholy little sighs, and this time the poor gnat really seemed to have sighed itself away, for When Alice looked up, there was nothing whatever to be seen sitting on the twig, and as she was getting rather chilly with sitting still so long, she got up and walked on. She very soon came to an open field with a wood on the other side of it. It looked much darker than the last wood, and Alice felt a little timid about going into it. However, on second thought, she made up her mind to go on, for I certainly won't go back, she thought to herself, and this was the only way to the 8th square. This must be the wood, she said thoughtfully to herself, where things have no names. I wonder what'll become of my name when I go in. I shouldn't like to lose it at all, because they'd have to give me another, and it would be almost certain to be an ugly one. But then the fun would be trying to find the creature that has got my old name. That's just like the advertisements, you know, when people lose dogs. Answers to the name of Dash. Has on a brass collar. Just fancy calling everything you meet Alice till one of them answered. Only they wouldn't answer at all if they were wise. She was rambling on in this way when she reached the wood. It looked very cool and shady. Well, at any rate, it's a great comfort, she said, as she stepped under the trees after being so hot, to get into the... Into what? She went on, rather surprised at not being able to think of the word. I meant to get in under this, you know, putting her hand on the trunk of the tree. What does it call itself, I wonder? I do believe it's got no name. Why, to be sure, it hasn't. She stood silent for a minute, thinking. Then she suddenly began again. Then it really has happened after all, and now who am I? I will remember if I can. I'm determined to do it. But being determined didn't help much, and all she could say, after a great deal of puzzling, was, L. I know it begins with an L. Just then a fawn came wandering by. It looked at Alice with large, gentle eyes, but it didn't seem at all frightened. Here then, she said, as she held out her hand and tried to stroke it, but it only started back a little and then stood looking at her again. What do you call yourself? The fawn said at last. Such a soft, sweet voice it had. I wish I knew, thought poor Alice. She answered rather sadly, Nothing just now. Think again, it said. That won't do. Alice thought, but nothing came of it. Please, would you tell me what you call yourself? She said a little timidly. I think that might help a little. I'll tell you if you'll move a little further on, the fawn said. I can't remember here. So they walked on together through the wood, Alice with her arms clasped lovingly round the soft neck of the fawn. A fawn's a young deer. Till they came out into another open field, and here the fawn gave a sudden bound into the air and shook itself free from Alice's arms. I'm a fawn, it cried out in a voice of delight, and dear me, you're a human child. A sudden look of alarm came into its beautiful brown eyes, and in another moment it had darted away at full speed. Alice stood looking after it, almost ready to cry with vexation at having lost her dear little fellow traveller so suddenly. However, I know my name now, she said. That's some comfort. Alice. Alice. I won't forget it again. And now, which of these finger posts ought I to follow, I wonder? A finger post is one of those ones where it's a stick with a finger poking out and the name of the place that you're going to on each finger. And they point along the different roads. Signpost. Finger post. And we're trying to find the right line again. It was not a very difficult question to answer, as there was only one road through the wood, and the two finger posts both pointed along it. I'll settle it, Alice said to herself, when the road divides and they point different ways. But this did not seem likely to happen. She went on and on a long way, but wherever the road divided, there were sure to be two finger posts pointing the same way, one marked to Tweedledum's house and the other to the house of Tweedledee. I do believe, said Alice at last, that they live in the same house. I wonder I've never thought of that before, but I can't stay there long. I'll just call and say, how do you do, and ask them the way out of the wood. If I could only get to the 8th square before it gets dark. So she wandered on, talking to herself as she went, till, on turning a sharp corner, she came upon two fat little men so suddenly that she could not help starting back. That means like that. But in another moment she recovered herself, feeling sure that they must be. And I'm going to have a drink of water before I read the next chapter. Don't forget to drink your water. And if Lemon's there, I can't tell because my chat's not showing anything. Maybe it's on the wrong mod settings. Don't forget to have your water too, Lemon. Try and get all the itchies out of the way, and then we'll carry on with the next bit. Chapter 4, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. They were standing under a tree, each with an arm around the other's neck, and Alice knew which was which in a moment, because one of them had Dum embroidered on his collar, and the other Dee. I suppose they've each got Tweedle round at the back of the collar, she said to herself. They stood so still that she quite forgot they were alive, and she was just looking round to see if the word Tweedle was written at the back of each collar, when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked Dum. "If you think we're waxworks," he said, "you ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made to be looked at for nothing, nohow." "Contrariwise," added the one marked D, if you think we're alive, you ought to speak." "I'm sure I'm very sorry," was all Alice could say, for the words of the old song kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock, and she could hardly help saying them out loud. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow, as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. "I know what you're thinking about," said Tweedledum, "but it isn't so, nohow." "Contrariwise," continued Tweedledee, "if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be, but as it isn't, it ain't. That's logic." "I was thinking," Alice said very politely, "which is the best way out of this wood? It's getting so dark. Would you tell me, please?" But the little men only looked at each other and grinned. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum and saying, "First boy." "Nohow," Tweedledum cried out briskly, and shut his mouth up again with a snap. "Next boy," said Alice, passing on to Tweedledee, though she felt quite certain he would only shout out contrariwise, and so he did. "You've been wrong," cried Tweedledum. "The first thing in a visit is to say how d'ye do and shake hands," and here the two brothers gave each other a hug, and then they held out the two hands that were free to shake hands with her. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them, first for fear of hurting the other one's feelings, so as the best way out of the difficulty she took hold of both hands at once. The next moment they were dancing round in a ring. This seemed quite natural, as she remembered afterwards, and she was not even surprised to hear music playing. It seemed to come from under the tree under which they were dancing, and it was done, as well as she could make it out, by the branches rubbing one across the other like fiddles and fiddlesticks. "But it certainly was funny," Alice said afterwards, when she was telling her sister the history of all this, "to find myself singing 'Here we go round the mulberry bush.' I don't know when I began it, but somehow I felt as if I'd been singing it a long, long time." The other two dancers were fat and very soon out of breath. "4 times round is enough for one dance," Tweedledum panted out, and they left off dancing as suddenly as they had begun. The music stopped at the same moment. Then they let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a minute. There was a rather awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she had just been dancing with. "It would never do to say how do you do now," she said to herself. "We seem to have got beyond that somehow. I hope you are not much tired," she said at last. "Nohow, and thank you very much for asking," said Tweedledum. "So much obliged," added Tweedledee. "You like poetry?" "Yes, pretty well. Some poetry," Alice said doubtfully. "Would you tell me which road leads out of the wood?" "What shall I repeat to her?" said Tweedledee, looking round at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes and not noticing Alice's question. "The walrus and the carpenter is the longest," Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. Tweedledee began instantly. The sun was shining. Here Alice ventured to interrupt him. If it's very long, she said as politely as she could, would you please tell me first which road? Tweedledee smiled gently and began again. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead, there were no birds to fly. The walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat, and this was odd because, you know, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, the walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar besides are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice. The carpenter said nothing, but cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing, but the butter's spread too thick. I weep for you, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer came there none. And that was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. I like the walrus best, said Alice, because you see he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. He ate more than the carpenter, though, said Tweedledee. You see, he held his handkerchief in front so that the carpenter couldn't count how many he took, contrary-wise. That was mean, Alice said indignantly. Then I like the carpenter best, if he didn't eat so many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could get, said Tweedledum. This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began. Well, they were both very unpleasant characters. Here she checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine in the wood near them, though she feared it was more likely to be a wild beast. Are there any lions or tigers about here? She asked timidly. It's only the Red King snoring, said Tweedledee. Come and look at him, the brothers cried, and they each took one of Alice's hands and led her up to where the king was sleeping. Isn't he a lovely sight, said Tweedledum. Alice couldn't honestly say that he was. He had a tall red nightcap on with a tassel, and he was lying crumpled up into a sort of untidy heap and snoring loud, fit to snore his head off, as Tweedledum remarked. "I'm afraid he'll catch cold with lying on the damp grass," said Alice, who was a very thoughtful little girl. "He's dreaming now," said Tweedledee. "And what do you think he's dreaming about?" Alice said, "Nobody can guess that." "Why, about you," Tweedledee exclaimed, clapping his hands triumphantly. "And if he left off dreaming about you, where do you suppose you'd be?" "Where I am now, of course," said Alice. "Not you," Tweedledee retorted contemptuously. "You'd be nowhere. Why, you're only a sort of thing in his dream." If that their king was to wake," added Tweedledum, "you'd go out, bang, just like a candle." "I shouldn't," Alice exclaimed indignantly. "Besides, if I'm only a sort of thing in his dream, what are you, I should like to know?" "Ditto," said Tweedledum. "Ditto, ditto," cried Tweedledee. He shouted this so loud that Alice couldn't help saying, "Hush, you'll be waking him." I'm afraid if you make so much noise." "Well, it's no use your talking about waking him," said Tweedledum, "when you're only one of the things in his dream. You know very well you're not real." "I am real," and Alice began to cry. "You won't make yourself a bit realer by crying," Tweedledee remarked. "There's nothing to cry about." "If I wasn't real," Alice said, half laughing through her tears. It all seemed so ridiculous. "I shouldn't be able to cry." "I hope you don't suppose those are real tears," Tweedledum interrupted in a tone of great contempt. "I know they're talking nonsense," Alice thought to herself, "and it's foolish to cry about it." So she brushed away her tears and went on as cheerfully as she could. "At any rate, I'd better be getting out of the wood, for really it's coming on very dark. Do you think it's going to rain?" Tweedledum spread a large umbrella over himself and his brother and looked up into it. "No, I don't think it is," he said, "at least not under here, nohow. But it may rain outside?" "It may, if it chooses," said Tweedledee. "We've no objection, contrariwise." Selfish things, thought Alice, and she was just going to say good night and leave them when Tweedledum sprang out from under the umbrella and seized her by the wrist. "Do you see that?" he said, in a voice choking with passion, and his eyes grew large and yellow all in a moment, as he pointed with a trembling finger at a small white thing lying under the tree. "It's only a rattle," Alice said after a careful examination of the white thing. "Not a rattlesnake, you know," she added hastily, thinking that he was frightened. "Only an old rattle, quite old and broken." "I knew it was," cried Tweedledum, beginning to stamp about wildly and tear his hair. "It's spoilt, of course." Here he looked at Tweedledee, who immediately sat down on the ground and tried to hide himself under the umbrella. Alice laid her hand upon his arm and said in a soothing tone, "You needn't be so angry about an old rattle." "But it isn't old," Tweedledum cried in a greater fury than ever. "It's new, I tell you. I bought it yesterday, my nice new rattle." And his voice rose to a perfect scream. All this time Tweedledee was trying his best to fold up the umbrella with himself in it, which was such an extraordinary thing to do that it quite took off Alice's attention from the angry brother. But he couldn't quite succeed, and it ended in his rolling over, bundled up in the umbrella, with only his head out. And there he lay, opening and shutting his mouth and large eyes, looking more like a fish than anything else, thought Alice. Of course you agree to have a battle," Tweedledum said in a calmer tone. "I suppose so," the other sulkily replied as he crawled out of the umbrella. "Only she must help us to dress up, you know." So the two brothers went off hand in hand into the woods, and returned in a minute with their arms full of things such as bolsters, blankets, hearthrugs, tablecloths, dish covers, and coal scuttles. "I hope you're a good hand at pinning and tying strings," Tweedledum remarked. "Every one of these things has got to go on somehow or other." Alice said afterwards she had never seen such a fuss made about anything in all her life, the way those two bustled about, and the quantity of things they put on, and the trouble they gave her in tying strings and fastening buttons. "Really, they'll be more like bundles of old clothes than anything else by the time they're ready," she said to herself. as she arranged a bolster around the neck of Tweedledee to keep his head from being cut off, as he said. "You know," he added very gravely, "it's one of the most serious things that can possibly happen to one in battle, to get one's head cut off." Alice laughed aloud, but she managed to turn it into a cough for fear of hurting his feelings. "Do I look very pale?" said Tweedledum, coming up to have his helmet tied on. He called it a helmet, though it certainly looked much more like a saucepan. "Well, yes, a little," Alice replied gently. "I'm very brave generally," he went on in a low voice. "Only today I happen to have a headache." "And I've got a toothache," said Tweedledee, who had overheard the remark. "I'm far worse off than you." "Then you'd better not fight today," said Alice, thinking it was a good opportunity to make peace. "We must have a bit of a fight, but I don't care about it going on long," said Tweedledum. "What's the time now?" Tweedledee looked at his watch and said 4:30. "Let's fight till 6 and then have dinner," said Tweedledum. "Very well," the other said, rather sadly, "and she can watch us, only you'd better not come very close," he added. "I generally hit everything I can see when I get really excited." "And I hit everything within reach," cried Tweedledum, "whether I can see it or not." Alice laughed. "You must hit the trees pretty often, I should think," she said. Tweedledum looked round him with a satisfied smile. "I don't suppose," he said, "there'll be a tree left standing for ever so far around by the time we've finished." "And all about a rattle," said Alice, hoping to make them a little ashamed of fighting for such a trifle. "I shouldn't have minded it so much," said Tweedledum, if it hadn't been a new one. Sorry, itchy nose because of the feathers. "I wish the monstrous crow would come," thought Alice. "There's only one sword, you know," Tweedledum said to his brother, "but you can have the umbrella. It's quite as sharp. Only we must begin quick. It's getting as dark as it can." "And darker," said Tweedledee. It was getting dark so suddenly that Alice thought there must be a thunderstorm coming on. "What a thick black cloud that is," she said, "and how fast it comes. Why, I do believe it's got wings." "It's the crow!" Tweedledum cried out in a shrill voice of alarm, and the two brothers took to their heels and were out of sight in a moment. Alice ran a little way into the wood and stopped under a large tree. "It can never get at me here," she thought. "It's far too large to squeeze itself in among the trees. But I wish it wouldn't flap its wings so. It makes quite a hurricane in the wood. Here's somebody's shawl being blown away." And that was the end of that chapter. So I'm having another drink of water, and you better have one too. Remember, drinking water is good for your health, and it's good for your voice. So how's your day going? I hope it's good. I hope you've been behaving yourself. And depending on where you are, it may actually still be Sunday where you are. It's Monday here. And that's enough water for that chapter break. So, now if you're wanting to chat with me on Twitch, you need to follow me because of the way that chat is set up. You can't actually chat unless you've followed me already. So here we go. Chapter 5, Wool and Water. That's an odd name for a chapter. Let's turn this microphone around a bit. She caught the shawl as she spoke and looked about for the owner. In another moment the White Queen came running wildly through the wood, with both arms stretched out wide as if she were flying, and Alice very civilly went to meet her with the shawl. "I'm very glad I happened to be in the way," Alice said as she helped her to put on her shawl again. The White Queen only looked at her in a helpless, frightened sort of way, and kept repeating something in a whisper to herself that sounded like bread and butter, bread and butter. And Alice felt that if there were to be any conversation at all, she must manage it herself. So she began rather timidly, "Am I addressing the White Queen?" "Well, yes, if you call that addressing," the Queen said. "It isn't my notion of the thing at all." Alice thought it would never do to have an argument at the very beginning of their conversation, so she smiled and said, "If your Majesty will only tell me the right way to begin, I'll do it as well as I can." "But I don't want it done at all," groaned the poor Queen. "I've been addressing myself for the last 2 hours. It would have been all the better, as it seemed to Alice, if she had got someone else to dress her. She was so dreadfully untidy. Every single thing's crooked, Alice thought to herself, and she's all over pins. May I put your shawl straight for you? She added aloud. I don't know what's the matter with it, the Queen said in a melancholy voice. It's out of temper, I think. I've pinned it here and I've pinned it there, but there's no pleasing it. It can't go straight, you know, if you pin it all on one side, Alice said, as she gently put it right for her. And dear me, what a state your hair is in. The brush has got entangled in it, the Queen said with a sigh, and I lost the comb yesterday. Alice carefully released the brush and did her best to get the hair into order. Come, you look rather better now, she said, after altering most of the pins. But really you should have a lady's maid. I'm sure I'll take you with pleasure, the Queen said. 2pence a week and jam every other day. Alice couldn't help laughing as she said, I don't want you to hire me, and I don't care for jam. It's very good jam, said the Queen. Well, I don't want any today at any rate. You couldn't have it if you did want it, the Queen said. The rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. Must come sometimes to jam today, Alice objected. No, it can't, said the Queen. It's jam every other day. Today isn't any other day, you know. I don't understand you, said Alice. It's dreadfully confusing. That's the effect of living backwards, the Queen said kindly. It always makes one a little giddy at first. Living backwards, Alice repeated in great astonishment. I never heard of such a thing. But there's one great advantage in it. That's one's memory works both ways. I'm sure mine only works one way, Alice remarked. I can't remember things before they happen. It's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards, the Queen remarked. What sort of things do you remember best? Alice ventured to ask. Oh, things that happen the week after the next. Next, the Queen replied in a careless tone. For instance, now, she said. She went on, sticking a large piece of plaster on her finger as she spoke. There's the King's messenger. He's in prison now, being punished, and the trial doesn't even begin till next Wednesday, and of course the crime comes last of all. Suppose he never commits the crime, said Alice. That would be all the better, wouldn't it? The Queen said as she bound the plaster round her finger with a bit of ribbon. Alice felt there was no denying that. Of course it would be all the better, she said, but it wouldn't be all the better his being punished. You're wrong there at any rate, said the Queen. Were you ever punished? Only for faults, said Alice. And were you all the better for it? And you were all the better for it, I know, the Queen said triumphantly. Yes, but then I had done the thing I was punished for, said Alice, and that makes all the difference. But if you hadn't done them, the Queen said, that would have been better still. Better and better and better. Her voice went higher with each better, not like the way mine did, till it got quite a squeak at last. Alice was just beginning to say, there's a mistake somewhere, when the Queen began screaming so loud that she had to leave the sentence unfinished. Oh, oh, oh! The Queen shaking her hand about as if she wanted to shake it off. My finger's bleeding! Oh, oh, oh! Her screams were so exactly like the whistle of a steam engine that Alice had to hold her hands over her ears. Just as well I can't do that sort of yell. What is the matter, she said as soon as there was a chance of making herself heard. Have you pricked your finger? I haven't pricked it yet, the Queen said, but I soon shall. Oh, oh, oh! When do you expect to do it? Alice asked, feeling very much inclined to laugh. When I fasten my shawl again, the poor Queen groaned out. The brooch will come undone directly. Oh, oh! And as she said the words, the brooch flew open, and the Queen clutched wildly at it and tried to clasp it again. Take care, said Alice, you're holding it all crooked. And she caught at the brooch, but it was too late. The pin had slipped, and the Queen had pricked her finger. That accounts for the bleeding, you see, she said to Alice with a smile. Now you understand the way things happen around here. But why don't you scream now? Alice asked, holding her hands ready to put over her ears again. Why, I've done all the screaming already, said the Queen. What would be the good of having it all over again? By this time it was getting light. The crow must have flown away, I think, said Alice. I'm so glad it's gone. I thought it was the night coming on. I wish I could manage to be glad, the Queen said. Only I never can remember the rule. You must be very happy living in this wood and being glad whenever you like. "Only it's so very lonely here," Alice said in a melancholy voice, and at the thought of her loneliness, 2 large tears came rolling down her cheeks. "Oh, don't go on like that," cried the poor Queen, wringing her hands in despair. "Consider what a great girl you are. Consider what a long way you've come today. Consider what o'clock it is. Consider anything, only don't cry." Alice couldn't help laughing at this, even in the midst of her tears. "Can you keep from crying by considering things?" she asked. "That's the way it's done," the Queen said with great decision. "Nobody can do 2 things at once, you know. Let's consider your age to begin with. How old are you?" "I'm 7.5 exactly." "You needn't say exactually," the Queen remarked. "I can believe it without that. Now I'll give you something to believe. I'm just 101, 5 months and a day." "I can't believe that," said Alice. "Can't you?" said the Queen in a pitying tone. "Try again. Draw a long breath and shut your eyes." Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." "There goes the shawl again." The brooch had come undone as she spoke, and a sudden gust of wind blew the Queen's shawl across a little brook. The Queen spread out her arms again and went flying after it, and this time she succeeded in catching it for herself. "I've got it," she cried in a triumphant tone. "Now you shall see me pin it on again, all by myself." "Then I hope your finger is better now," Queen Alice said very politely as she crossed the little brook after the Queen. "Oh, much better," cried the Queen, her voice rising to a squeak as she went on. "Much better, 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 better." The last word ended in a long bleat, so like a sheep that Alice quite started. She looked at the Queen, who seemed to have suddenly wrapped herself up in wool. Alice rubbed her eyes and looked again. She couldn't make out what had happened at all. Was she in a shop? And was it really a sheep that was sitting on the other side of the counter? Rub as she could make nothing more of it. Rubbing her eyes. She was in a little dark shop, leaning with her elbows on the counter, and opposite to her was an old sheep, sitting in an armchair, knitting, and every now and then leaving off to look at her through a great pair of spectacles. "What is it you want to buy?" the sheep said at last, looking up for a moment from her knitting. "I don't quite know yet," Alice said very gently. "I should like to look all around me first, if I might." "You may look in front of you and on both sides, if you like," said the sheep, "but you can't look all round you unless you've got eyes in the back of your head." But these, as it happened, Alice had not got, so she contented herself with turning round, looking at the shelves as she came to them. The shop seemed to be full of all manner of curious things, but the oddest part of it all was that whenever she looked hard at any shelf to make out exactly what it had on it, that particular shelf was always quite empty, though the others round it were crowded as full as they could hold. "Things flow so about here," she said at last in a plaintive tone, after she had spent a minute or so in vainly pursuing a large bright thing that sometimes looked like a doll and sometimes like a work-box, and was always in the shelf next above the one she was looking at. "And this one is the most provoking of all. But I'll tell you what," she added as a sudden thought struck her, "I'll follow it up to the very top shelf of all. It'll puzzle it to go through the ceiling, I suppose." But even this plan failed. The thing went through the ceiling as quietly as possible, as if it were quite used to it. "Are you a child or a teetotum?" the sheep said as she took up another pair of needles. "You'll make me giddy soon if you go on turning round like that." She was now working with 14 pairs at once, knitting needles, and Alice couldn't help looking at her in great astonishment. How can she knit with so many? The puzzled child thought to herself. She gets more and more like a porcupine every minute. "Can you row?" the sheep asked, handing her a pair of knitting needles as she spoke. "Yes, a little, but not on land and not with needles." Alice was beginning to say, when suddenly the needles turned into oars in her hands, and she found that they were in a little boat, gliding along between banks, so there was nothing for it but to do her best. "Feather!" cried the sheep as she took up another pair of needles. This didn't sound like a remark that needed any answer, so Alice said nothing but pulled away. There was something very queer about the water, she thought, as every now and then the oars got fast in it and would hardly come out again. "Feather! Feather!" the sheep cried again, taking more needles. "You'll be catching a crab directly." A dear little crab, Alice thought. I should like that. "Didn't you hear me say feather?" the sheep cried angrily, taking up quite a bunch of needles. "Indeed I did," said Alice. "You've said it very often and very loud. Please, where are the crabs?" "In the water, of course," said the sheep, sticking some of the needles into her hair as her hands were full. "Feather, I say. Why do you say feather so often?" Alice asked at last, rather vexed. "I'm not a bird." "You are," said the sheep. "You're a little goose." This offended Alice a little, so there was no more conversation for a minute or two, while the boat glided gently on, sometimes among beds of weeds which made the oars stick fast in the water worse than ever, and sometimes under trees, but always with the same tall river banks frowning over their heads. "Oh, please, there are some scented rushes," Alice cried with such a transport of delight. "There really are, and such beauties." "You needn't say please to me about 'em," the sheep said without looking up from her knitting. "I didn't put 'em there, and I'm not going to take 'em away." "No, but I meant please may we wait and pick some," Alice pleaded, "if you don't mind stopping the boat for a minute." "How am I to stop it?" said the sheep. "If you leave off rowing, it'll stop itself." So the boat was left to drift down the stream as it would, till it glided gently in among the waving rushes. And then the little sleeves were carefully rolled up, and the little arms were plunged in elbow deep to get the rushes a good long way down before breaking them off, and for a while Alice forgot all about the sheep and the knitting as she bent over the side of the boat with just the ends of her tangled hair dipping into the water, while with bright eager eyes she caught at one bunch after another of the darling scented rushes. I'm guessing they're flowers. "I only hope the boat won't tipple over," she said to herself. "Oh, what a lovely one! Only I couldn't quite reach it, and it certainly did seem a little provoking, almost as if it happened on purpose," she thought, that though she managed to pick plenty of beautiful rushes as the boat glided by, there was always a more lovely one that she couldn't reach. "The prettiest are always further," she said at last with a sigh at the obstinacy of the rushes in growing so far off, as with flushed cheeks and dripping hair and hands she scrambled back into her place and began to arrange her new-found treasures. What mattered it to her just then that the rushes had begun to fade and to lose all their scent and beauty from the very moment she had picked them? Even real scented rushes, you know, last only a very little while, and these, being dream rushes, melted away almost like snow as they lay in heaps at her feet. But Alice hardly noticed this. There were so many other curious things to think about. They hadn't gone much farther before the blade of one of the oars got fast in the water and wouldn't come out again, so Alice explained it afterwards. And the consequence was that the handle of it got caught under her chin, and in spite of a series of little shrieks of "Oh, oh, oh!" from poor Alice, it swept her straight off the seat and down among the heap of rushes. However, she wasn't hurt, and was soon up again. The sheep went on with her knitting all the while, just as if nothing had happened. "That was a nice crab you caught," she remarked, as Alice got back into her place, very much relieved to find herself still in the boat. "Wait, was it? I didn't see it," said Alice, peeping cautiously over the side of the boat into the dark water. "I wish it hadn't let go. I should so like to see a little crab to take home with me." But the sheep only laughed scornfully and went on with her knitting. "Are there many crabs here?" said Alice. "Crabs and all sorts of things," said the sheep. "Plenty of choice. Only make up your mind. Now what do you want to buy?" "To buy?" Alice echoed in a tone that was half astonished and half frightened, for the oars and the boat and the river had vanished all in a moment, and she was back again in the little dark shop. "I should like to buy an egg, please," she said timidly. "How do you sell them?" "5 farthing for one, 2 for two," the sheep replied. "Then "Two are cheaper than one," Alice said in a surprised tone, taking out her purse. "Only you must eat them both if you buy two," said the sheep. "Then I'll have one, please," said Alice as she put the money down on the counter, for she thought to herself that they mightn't be at all nice, you know. The sheep took the money and put it away in a box. Then she said, "I never put things in people's hands. That would never do. You must get it for yourself." And so saying, she went off to the other end of the shop and set the egg upright on a shelf. "I wonder why it wouldn't do," thought Alice as she groped her way among the tables and chairs, for the shop was very dark towards the end. "The egg seems to get further away the more I walk towards it. Let me see, is this a chair? Why, it's got branches, I declare. How very odd to find trees growing in here. And actually, here's a little brook. Why, this is the very queerest shop I've ever seen." So she went on, wondering more and more at every step, as everything turned into a tree the moment she came up to it, and she quite expected the egg to do the same. And that's the end of that chapter, and I'm finishing for today because it's nearly 4 o'clock New Zealand time. See you next time. Bye. Now we just have to get to the mouse so we can click on it to finish.